Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Startup Onramp launch meeting. We are announcing the partnership with Startup Onramp today with Silicon Beach Group. And Colin here is going to take us through all the bullshit that we hear on startup community. My name is Abdullah Bogara. I'm the lead organizer of Melbourne Silicon Beach and Brisbane Silicon Beach and a few other Silicon Beaches, as well as the CEO of Silicon Beach Group. It's a non-for-profit company that was recently formed to take Silicon Beach forward. And for those of you who joined through Eventbrite, Silicon Beach is the largest startup community network in Australia with meetup communities around the country. We have about 24,000 Silicon Beaches around the country. We're also opened in Manila and Jakarta recently. So we are going Asia Pacific. Colin, just before we start, I need to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands from which we joined today. I know a lot of you are spread around the country. Colin is from Brisbane, and we've got various people from various lands. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's so very important at this time to learn from the traditional indigenous people who have lived peacefully on this land for nearly 60,000 years. I think we, as innovators, have a lot to learn. Okay, with that out of the way, I need to also thank our sponsors. It's thanks to the sponsors that we can present all these events free of charge to you guys, to empower founders, and we are on a mission to take Australia to #2 startup nation in the world. We were #5 last year. Now we have slipped to #7. We're going in the opposite direction. So we need people like Colin and Startup Onramp to take you all to on your startup journey to create successful startups to lower the chance of failure. You can check those rankings at startuplink.com. They're the ones who do those rankings. Our sponsors are, first of all, Allied Legal. It's a law firm as well as a sales and business development firm. alliedlegal.com.au. You can check them out. I'll put all those links in chat. And if you're watching this on the recording, you'll see those links in the YouTube description. The other sponsors are AppDemoVideos. And also we have Yalmaa Digital agency. AppDemoVideos.com is actually creating special kinds of videos for apps and e-commerce sites and things like that. You get a lot of demonstration videos on their site. And Yalmaa Digital is a web design and app development company. So we are adding Startup Onramp to that cohort as well from today. So you will see their link, special affiliate link I have put on chat, and I put it on the YouTube description as well. Click on that. Not only you get 50% off the Startup Onramp course, you get Colin and the team is giving a partnership commission to Silicon Beach as well for us to continue this work. So you're helping, not only investing yourself and helping yourself, you're helping the community to help others as well. So don't forget to click on the affiliate link before you join the program. Hope lots of you will join after hearing all the myths and misconceptions around. I joined Silicon Beach in 2012 to start my own startup, but I heard so much, listened to so much bullshit that I never launched my startup. So my mission is to not let that happen to any of you. With that, I think I have spoken enough. Hand over to Colin to introduce yourself. Actually, I didn't go through your bio. I'll let you go introduce yourself. But most importantly, there's something that is not in your bio. Colin was one of the founding organizers of Brisbane Silicon Beach. So back in 2011, I think that's before any of us joined respective Silicon Beaches. So he understands what's going on in Silicon Beach and how so many people join wanting to start their startup but get stuck. So that is why he's very passionate that it doesn't happen to you guys. Over to you, Colin.
Okay, thanks, Atula. I'm really pleased that there's so many of you have shown up for this chat, so hopefully we'll make it really useful. Big thanks to Atula and Karen for the invitation to come and talk today. As Atula said, I've been involved in organizing Silicon Beach, Brisbane for several years, back when it was getting started. I remember we got it from a couple of dozen members up to about 3,000 over a few year period. So I'm really impressed with what Silicon Beach is continuing to do. I want to make this discussion as useful as possible. So what I've tried to do is to pull together a few thoughts based on my experience in working with now several hundred startup founders over the last couple of decades. The title for the talk is Startups Minus the BS. Unfortunately, I think there is actually a lot of BS in the startup ecosystem. It is improving. So, you know, the ranking that Atula mentioned is seeing us going in the right direction, but there's still a lot of things that hold people back. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and go through a few slides. I'll get 500 of my favorite PowerPoint slides on the screen, Atula. Would that be okay?
That's perfectly all right. I forgot to mention,
I won't do that.
You might have questions popping into your mind as Colin is going through this. So pop them in chat. Are you okay, Colin, to if people sort of unmute themselves and ask question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Jump in anytime.
We'll keep it pretty interactive. Yep. Go ahead.
Cool. So you should be able to see my slides now.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about startups minus the BS.
Favorite poo emoji. I can see that. Yep.
Yeah.
That's everyone's favorite emoji.
Yeah, it's essential. It's compulsory.
Yeah.
So, so we're going to talk about some of the BS that does the rounds in the startup scene. And I saw Morris Grasso there. Morris will know a lot of this. He and I co-invested. I was running a small seed fund, and I'll not go into any of the details, but there's a few investments that we've seen around the traps where there's a lot of BS that actually stops startups from succeeding. So let's jump into it. So to skip the kind of formal introductions, hi, I'm Colin. I guess having worked with a lot of startups, I've seen some successful ones and a much larger number of unsuccessful ones. And I reckon I've seen every way there is to fail in a startup. And I've seen just about every kind of BS there is in terms of what advice people give to startups and actually the advice that startup founders give to each other. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about some of that. I should actually say I have run multiple early stage funds, several startup accelerators, an incubator. I've done a whole stack of mentoring, run Silicon Valley immersion programs, and I do a lot of coaching of startup founders. So I think, you know, it is actually possible to distill some of the learnings from successful founders and say, look, these are the things that consistently lead people to be successful. And conversely, here are the things that consistently cause startups to fail. So we're going to focus mostly on failure today, but also we'll pick up a few of the positive things you can do. So why are we talking about this? I guess the main reason is that BS causes startups to fail. And that can take the form of bad advice or urban myths that you might read about. The media is getting better, but there's still a lot of BS in the media when it comes to startups. You tend to only read about startups when they've raised $10 million or more. And there's a lot of stuff that happens before you read about them. So we're going to unpack some of that. The other issue for those of you that are working on ideas that are not yet real startups, and maybe have something that you're working on as a side hustle, a lot of the BS that we see actually stops people from starting companies. And so where I focus my time with Startup Onramp is with people who are in the first year or two of their startup and really helping to make sure that they get a good start. So we're going to try and unpack some of those myths as well. Okay, so let's talk some BS. I've got a dozen BS statements that are the kind of the core points that I want us to go through. And I also want to make sure that we leave some time for discussion. So Atula, I'm going to assume that you'll do that at some point if we're running out of time.
I'll keep an eye on the time, don't worry.
Cool, thank you. So the first and really critical one for people who are at an idea stage is that startups are risky. So I said before that I've worked with more unsuccessful startups than successful ones. And actually, if you look at the research, the reality is that about 90% of all startups fail. So you'd have to conclude from that startups are actually risky. And I think that's a true statement, except that I think a large proportion of the startups that fail actually do it because the founders make predictable and avoidable mistakes. Not all of the time. There's sometimes that there's nothing you could do about it. If Facebook decides to do what you're doing and throws 100 people at it, you're going to be in a tough spot. But actually, I think a lot of failures are avoidable. In the current climate, we of course have to look at the alternative. And if you look at where we are right now, here's a Business Insider article from a week or so back that says that by Christmas, 1 in 10 Australian workers will be unemployed. Depending on how the next 6 weeks or so goes, we'll probably revisit that and see how we're looking as a country. But right now, I think the idea that being an employee for almost any kind of business is really nowhere near as safe as it was a year ago. And so I think, startups are somewhat risky, but I think there are some things that you can do to de-risk them pretty significantly. And we should talk about some of those as we go through. So the second BS statement that you hear a lot when people are getting started is that you have to be all in. You've got to quit your job before you do a startup. Yeah, sure, you can kind of explore ideas, but at some point you really have to, go from 0 to 1. And I think this is actually really unhelpful. For those of you who have made that leap already, hopefully you've been able to do it in a progressive way. But for any of you who are still, tinkering on something and you haven't made the leap, the one piece of advice I would give you is do not go from 0 to 1. Do it progressively. I wanted to show you something that I find helpful as a kind of a discussion starter in terms of how to think through risk in a startup. And so this is a pretty simple plot showing uncertainty decreasing. So on the left axis, uncertainty decreasing over time, and your investment as the founder increasing over time. And so you can think of a startup as having 2 discrete phases. The first phase is search. And so this is where, if you look at the kind of lean startup methodology and, Eric Ries, Steve Blank et al., they talk about the lean startup build, measure, learn cycle. And so this search phase can, for almost every startup, be really cheap and efficient. So you can be in the search phase where you're unpacking the assumptions behind your business and testing them without having to spend a lot of time or a lot of money, and certainly without having to go all in and quit, whatever it is that generates your source of income. If you've got a couple of $1 million in your back pocket and you're happy to go all in and to have a couple of shots on goal, that's great. But I think the reality is, for nearly everybody, we need to be conserving cash and also conserving time, because people only have a finite amount of time that they can throw at this. So the other side of that then is, once you've been able to decrease the uncertainty and validate some of your really core assumptions, you can increase investment. And that might be that you say, right, I'm going from working full-time to working 2 days a week. Or you might be able to say, I'm going to go and do some freelancing to earn some income, but I'm going to put meaningful time into my startup. You might equally say, I'm going to put my savings into it. And that might be $5,000, it might be $50,000. But it's a point where you can say, all right, this makes sense for me to be an investor in my own company, both in terms of time and capital. At some point, you'll probably get to a stage where you can say, we have de-risked this opportunity and we have removed the uncertainty to a point where we can actually go and get other people to put some capital into it too. And so I think that's an important point to get to for some companies. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So one thing that a lot of people find really helpful is this really simple 2x2 matrix that is actually really good if you're in a team. You can do it as a sole founder as well, But if you're in a team, it's a really helpful way of testing your assumptions in an efficient way. So you can plot any assumption behind your startup on two axes. The vertical axis here is important versus trivial. So an important assumption is one that pretty much has to hold true. If it's not true, then you really don't have a business, or you're going to have to do something, you know, fundamentally different to make this work. On the horizontal axis, you've got known and unknown. So an unknown assumption is one where you're really just guessing. You don't have any facts, any data. You're really just saying, well, all we can do is speculate. A known assumption is one about which you do actually have some really solid information. And so it's hopefully pretty self-evident that where you should spend your time early on is in the top right-hand quadrant. So test the assumptions that are important and unknown. So these are the ones where you need to go and do some work to find out the information, and it's really critical to the viability of your business. If you're in a team, this is a really good exercise to do on a whiteboard or virtual whiteboard at the moment, or just get a big bit of paper and put it on the kitchen table, and test write down your assumptions that you want to test and plot them on this 2x2. And you might only end up with 3 or 4 that are in the top right quadrant, but it could be a really useful way to to get started. So I thought I'd just briefly mention a quick case study. So one of the companies that have been through Startup Onramp fairly recently is this one called Hoops. They're a back-end process management system for screen printing businesses. And the founder, Brad Pangeli, actually did something really smart, I think, which was he started it while continuing to run his day job, which was the screen printing business. So he started as a screen printer. He has a small business in Queensland. They're growing, they're successful. It's a screen printing business, so it's not a startup. It's not going to take over the world. But he decided that it would be useful to create a software tool to automate a lot of the processes in his business. And it turned out that it was actually really effective. It improved his profit margins. Things, were a whole lot more streamlined. And so he said, you know what? I reckon there are probably other screen printing businesses around the world that are currently running their business with a spreadsheet and a whiteboard and some post-it notes. So maybe they'd use this too. And he did some research and he found out that there are tens of thousands of those businesses around the world. And indeed, most of them are using a spreadsheet and a whiteboard at best to manage their business. So he's in the process of spinning that out, but he's done it progressively over a period of a couple of years, investing his own capital, exactly as we were talking about before with the kind of this thing, the reducing uncertainty over time and then increasing investment over time. So it's worked really well for him, and he's at a point where he can realistically jump into this full time and work on scaling it globally. So we were talking about commitment here, and so the advice that I'm giving to anyone who's at the very early stages is don't commit, but at some point you are going to have to commit. And for those of you who are involved in angel investing or any founders who have approached investors, one of the things that you will definitely see investors looking for is absolute commitment. So the analogy I like to use is breakfast. So if you're making bacon and eggs, you can think about the pig as being 100% committed to the outcome, whereas the chicken is really not that committed. So you can be a chicken for a long time, right? So you can work on your startup part-time, you can treat it as a side hustle, you can de-risk it for a period of time, but very definitely at the point where you need other people to put their money into your business, you need to show that you're at a point where you can be 100% focused on it. It's no longer a side hustle, it's no longer a part-time gig. The same thing applies when you're trying to bring other people in, either as co-founders or early employees. They're going to look for that pig level commitment as well. So I think that's important to have in mind. The third BS statement that seems to stop people before they even get started is that you have to be experienced. You have to have some kind of startup experience. And if we were all sitting here in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, probably most of us would be experienced in doing startups, or if not directly ourselves, we'd have 2 or 3 friends that we could lean on who've done startups. The reality is we're not in Silicon Valley. And so, there's often a lot of people that really have very little startup experience, and it stops them. I wanted to put a few really classic examples of inexperienced founders up just to kind of make a point here. There's our good friend, Mark Zuckerberg. He knew nothing about startups when he started his first startup, but it seems to have gone okay for him. A nice Australian example, Melanie Perkins, the co-founder of Canva. So Melanie and her boyfriend at the time, Cliff Obrecht, started in their spare bedroom. Likewise, they knew nothing about doing a startup. Melanie had had a couple of small businesses prior to this, but this was totally new to them. So I think, figuring it out on the way is absolutely possible. My favorite one is actually the Atlassian founders. So these guys actually didn't know what kind of business they wanted to start. So Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brooks, the two founders, dropped out of the University of New South Wales. They were studying computer science, and all they knew at the time was that they wanted to not be employees. They kind of knew that they wanted to build a business that was somewhere in the software space. They didn't really know what kind of business it was going to be. All they knew was that their number one objective was to not be employees of someone else. And they've done okay for themselves too. So I think what this means in practice is, if you don't already have a network of successful founders or others with, with really deep startup experience, you should go out of your way to surround yourself with people who do have that experience. And it used to be that, you would hang out at networking events. You would go to a Silicon Beach meetup in person, or you would go to your local co-working space and go to the pitch night on a Friday or whatever it is. A lot of those things still exist virtually, but I think you have to actually try harder to network in that way. The positive, I guess, at the moment when we're all doing things remotely and online, is that you can reach out to people anywhere on the planet. And so I always encourage founders to have a wish list of people that they would like to spend time talking to, wherever they might be, and to then work their networks. So use your LinkedIn, use whatever connections you've got to get warm introductions to those people. And what you'll find is that more often than not, people anywhere on the planet who genuinely believe that they could offer you some useful advice will be very happy to talk to you. Elon Musk might be at the more difficult end of the continuum in terms of people you can get hold of, but I've seen Australian startup founders get hold of some ostensibly really hard to pin down people by just reaching out and saying, "This is what I'm working on. I think that you would have some good insights. Can we line up a call?" Okay, so if we move from there into, all right, you've got an idea and you're actually working on it, and maybe you've launched something. One of the statements that I hear a lot is that this kind of bit of advice that says, don't tell people about your idea in case they steal it. I can see Morris is having a chuckle about this one. It's one of my bugbears. In some cases, a little bit of caution about who you tell your idea to might be okay, but I think my default is that you should always be pitching. You should always be telling people what you're working on, because if you don't, you're depriving yourself of feedback. And right back to what we were saying at the very beginning, that feedback loop is one of the most important things that you can get when you're an early stage founder. So learning about what customers need, learning about other startups and what they've done, you're only going to get that by talking about your idea. The other way to look at this is to say that if there is someone out there who is more likely to succeed turning your idea into a successful company than you are, then maybe they should do it. Maybe you're not the right person. So I think, you all should look at your idea that you're working on and say, okay, am I really the best person to pursue this? Do I have some deep insights into the problem, or have I got some ability to execute on this more effectively than somebody else who might hear about it? A quick plug for Silicon Beach, of course, because one of the most valuable things you can do is join online networking and pitching events. So if you haven't already, I'd strongly encourage you to jump into any of those that you can. And by pitching, you'll not only get practice delivering your pitch, you'll also get people to join you on the journey and perhaps offer you some help along the way. One really practical thing that I like to get startup founders to work on.
Give me a second, Colin,
Yeah, sure.
Just to interrupt. There was a question, where can people get the recording? The recording is always placed as a comment in the meetup event. So this will be in the past events after 2 o'clock today. So you can go in and see the recording. There are people who came in Eventbrite, will get an email. And also we'll send it out as a mail out to all of Silicon Beach in a few days' time. But for all the past recordings are available in the event pages. Thanks, Colin. If you have any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Attila. Yeah, so a format that a lot of people find really helpful is this thing called a Gaddy pitch. And it's 3 sentences. It was coined by a guy called Anthony Gaddy, who's a sales coach. And the first line starts with, you know how. And what it does is it gives you a really easy way conversationally to start describing to someone what your company does, but leading in with what problem are you solving and for what customer. And then the second line is, well, what we do is, and that gives you a chance to say, right, this is the solution that we're creating, and this is why it'll be beneficial to that particular customer. And then the last line is in fact, and this is where you can give some evidence or supporting statements or something that describes how big the opportunity is. And it's a really good way of getting people to understand what you do. Now, the other part of this is to actually road test it and practice. I've not met very many people who first time can get their pitch right. So, you know those conversations where you describe to someone what you're working on, and they look blankly at you and go, "I've no idea what you're working on." This is something that most people need to practice. So what I suggest you do, if you're not experienced at pitching, is get a few people who know nothing about what you're working on, try out your pitch, use the Gaddy pitch format or whatever format you like, but give them the kind of 60-second version, and then ask them to pitch it back to you. So ask them, VC funds do this. I know a few angel investors that do this as well, where they will test whether they've correctly understood the proposition behind the startup by pitching it to their colleagues and seeing whether their colleagues are able to pitch it back. And so if you pitch your idea to someone and they can get it like 80 or 90% right when they pitch it back to you, that means you're on track. If they really struggle, then it means you've got work to do. Okay, let's look at the next one, BS statement number 5, which is that you should ask friends and family for advice. Now, we all know that you're not going to ask your mum for business advice, but what I see a lot of people doing is they will ask their mate who's a lawyer or an accountant or runs a business of some other sort, but where their experience is not startup specific. So if your friend's a lawyer and they focus on property, or your uncle's an accountant, but he focuses on small business or corporate or charities, they're not going to have good advice for you. The other issue is that they will generally tell you they'll give you the polite answer. They'll tell you this is a great idea. And so you get this phenomenon, and it's a bit like, for those of us who've got dogs, you pat the dog on the head, dog loves it and says, yes, that's an awesome idea. You should totally go and pursue that. So I see this a lot where people actually get actually really unhelpful advice, but well-intentioned from people that are trying to offer encouragement. The best advice that you can get, or the best feedback you can get, is from people who have absolutely no qualms about telling you that your idea sucks and then telling you the 10 reasons why it sucks. So you should actively seek out those sorts of people. Related to that, for those of you who are still tinkering with an idea or perhaps multiple ideas, there's a simple way of looking at startup ideas to evaluate whether they make sense and whether you're likely to get this kind of pat on the head feedback. And that's this Venn diagram. So if you take the two sets that you see on the screen, the set on the left is all ideas that sound crazy. So these are the ones that when you first describe it to someone, people will say, yeah, no, that wouldn't work. I can't see that being a business. The set on the right is the ideas that are in fact good ideas that could be a successful startup. And so what I hope is that you'll be able to find an intersect where there are some great ideas that are, at first glance, most people would say this isn't going to work, but in fact they're a good idea. And the reason this is a really good place to be is it means you're much less likely to have hundreds of people working on similar things. And so if you think of like really successful companies like Airbnb, when they got started, they were absolutely in this intersect. So Airbnb, when they got started, had a whole lot of smart people say to them, this is a really stupid idea. People are not going to give their house keys to some random stranger for them to stay in their house, just earn a few extra bucks. It's not going to happen, at least not on any meaningful scale. And of course, fast forward to today, and Airbnb's been massively successful. So I think being in that intersect is a really good place to be. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Number 6 is you should write a business plan. Again, I don't think very many people write business plans these days. I certainly hope that they don't. At least not the 50, 60 page ones that people used to think were a good idea. If you're starting an established kind of business or a traditional kind of business, like a law firm or a cafe, maybe you should write a business plan because the business model is predictable. If you're doing a startup, almost by definition, you're engaging in business model innovation. And so you don't have the ability to predict how your business model will play out. So what I do see though is people will create 5-year cash flow forecasts, before they've launched a product, right? So it can be a good idea, right? So creating a cash flow forecast for your startup is probably a really good idea at some point, but I would focus more on the costs than the revenues. But you still see people that kind of go, oh yeah, well, I'm going to pitch investors and I've got my 50-page document and my 5-year cash flow forecasts and off we go. So my favorite line on this is from David Bland, who writes a lot on this topic. And he says, I don't read fiction, but when I do, it's a 100-page business plan, 5-year projections, all the numbers go up and to the right. So that's what you want to avoid, right? So the reality is that you just don't know. And I think smart investors, sophisticated investors these days also recognize that you don't know and you shouldn't be expected to know if you're, pre-launch or maybe just some early customers, early revenues. If you think, or if anyone thinks that you can predict, what your revenues will be in 5 years' time, that's really crystal ball gazing. So to close off on that point, I really like this definition of a startup from Dave McClure. So Dave's the founder of 500 Startups, Silicon Valley-based accelerator. And he describes a startup as a company that's confused about what its product is, who its customers are, and how it's going to make money. And so I think this is really helpful. I think of it kind of like puberty. It's a phase that startups go through. And during that phase, they don't really know what they're going to be when they grow up. But it's more than okay. It's actually necessary to exist in that phase for a while so that you can focus on search for a business model. So you're searching for a business model that's repeatable and scalable rather than trying to execute on something that you don't yet know is the right business model. So along that same line, there are some really simple tools that you can use. And in Startup Onramp, we do a lot of work with things like the value proposition canvas, which is this one here from Strategizer, which is really just intended to help founders tease out what jobs their product needs to do, what pains it will alleviate for customers, and what gains it will create, and then use that to kind of design their business model. And it's a really helpful one-page canvas. We also use the lean canvas, which is then kind of based on the business model canvas, which I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with. And then we like to get founders working on this thing called the validation board, which is another one-page tool, which is really aimed at getting you to articulate your assumptions. So that 2x2 matrix that we talked about earlier, that's where a lot of the assumptions will come from. And they go in here for you to then design experiments so that you can systematically test them. And you'll see it's got in the bottom part there, get out of the building. So that's the famous Steve Blank quote that says, there are no facts in the building, so you need to get out, talk to customers. And this is a really simple way of structuring that. Okay, we're beyond pre-launch now, and we're talking about building products. So one of my real bugbears when it comes to building product is this idea that you need to be able to code in order to start a startup or in order to build version 1.0 of your product. 5 or 10 years ago, this was probably true in most cases. Today, it's absolutely not. These are some of the simple, cheap, or in some cases, free tools that are available to help you create anything from a decent looking landing page up to a fully functional e-commerce or online business. And these are just some simple tools. I thought I'd put up also this longer list, which is from Scott Brinker, who's recently done an analysis of all of the no-code tools that are commonly used. And most of these things are very cheap or free, and they can allow you, whether you can program or not, to create really sophisticated products. My personal favorite is Zapier. I think of Zapier as internet glue. For any of you who've used it, it's a fantastic tool that allows you to connect almost anything with anything else, so that you can move data around pretty easily. So this is
just to interrupt you there, Colin. That's a great thing, because had I known this, 5 years ago, because I'm as a non-tech founder, this would have been really useful. But I think some of these were newer than 5 years, I think. But it's really good. Take a screenshot. It's in the recording as well, and have a look, because I was told constantly that I have to learn coding if I am to do a tech startup, at least so that I could talk to the developers. But I think that's a very powerful piece of bullshit advice you get.
Yeah.
Because how much can you learn? I mean, I'm not good at coding, and I'll make a very bad coder. Do you want to expand on that, Colin?
On how bad a coder you'd make?
Why people say that you have?
Yeah, look. So I think one of the problems that we see is, at some point you almost certainly, if you're building a tech business, you will need to have tech skills inside the team at some point. So that's a reality. But early on, to build an MVP, minimum viable product, or even version 1 of your product, in a lot of cases you can do it with no code. This actually leads to one of the really fundamental chicken and egg problems that we see in the startup scene all around Australia, which is people who are not programmers, and they decide that they need to go hire a programmer, either as a contractor or freelancer or whatever, to build version 1 of their product. And they hit up all of the angel groups all around the country, and any other investor who'll stand still long enough, and they say, hey, I've got an idea for a business, and this is the product that I want to build, and will you invest some money in my company so I can hire someone to build the product, to show it to a customer, to see whether they think it's a good idea. And that's usually a really short conversation. There are not very many investors that invest in ideas that are not yet products and haven't been shown to have value to customers. So I think the really critical thing, if you are non-technical, is to get something out there. Build an MVP or version 1 of your product, even if it's got a very limited feature set. Find out by talking to customers what the one piece of functionality is that will create value for them immediately, and build that. Deliver that to those customers and generate some revenues. And if you can do that, then you can reinvest those revenues in expanding on that first little tiny bit of value and functionality to make it more useful and more useful. And then at some point, you'll be able to have a conversation with either a technical co-founder or somebody that you might employ. He says, you know what, I think that's awesome, but I can see that you need my skills to help you expand on it, and I'd like to help. So we might come back to that if we got time for discussion, but I wanted to flag a couple of closely related points. So I mentioned before that, you're building a tech company, then at some point you will absolutely need to have tech skills in your team. Unfortunately, what some people do is they say, oh, great, well, I'll get tech skills and I can do that really cheaply. I'll offshore it, or I'll find an intern, or, my nephew, does a bit of kind of web development in his spare time. Mostly that does not work out well. So it can, and I'm not going to tell you that I think you should never consider it, but almost always companies that go for the cheapest possible way of building something, particularly when it's offshore and particularly when they have limited ability to control it, it usually goes very badly. So if you imagine you've got a budget of, let's say, $5,000, and you want to get an offshore development team to build your MVP, they may well have 100 clients on the go at any point in time. And your $5,000 job is probably the cheapest one that they're willing to work on. And so if they build it and then you come back a month later and say, hey, something's broken, or can you add this small little button, this piece of functionality? If you are the 100th client on their priority list that week, you're not going to get much back. So that's kind of the core of that issue. Related to that, I see a lot of people that kind of go, oh, well, you know, programmers are pretty cheap, right? So, you know, we can get a student to do this, or some dude who'll do it really cheap, and it'll be good enough to get us started. The reality is that good programmers are actually really expensive because they're highly skilled and their skills are in short supply. More than that, they only work on things that they want to work on. And so this is back to the Gaddy pitch and being able to explain the value proposition behind your startup. To get somebody to work on your project instead of the one that has a larger budget or that looks a bit more technically interesting and challenging, you need to either have more money or more interest. And so if you think about that, you know, you've got to be able to actually pitch it to those tech people. So the other part that kind of connects to that is that people go, oh, okay, so I don't have much money, but I'll offer equity. You know, I'll find a developer who's really good, and you know, I can't afford the $100,000 that it would cost me if I paid them cash, but I'll give them 2% of my company. It'll be sweet. This usually doesn't work well either. You know, 2% of zero is still zero. So if you haven't built anything yet, then you know, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a freelance developer just recently, and he said, you know, I have bills to pay. You know, I have a mortgage. I've got costs, and so your 2%, or even if it's 20% of your company that isn't yet worth anything, they can't take that to the bank to make mortgage payments or to buy their groceries. So it's kind of has to be cash. We often see this phenomenon where people say, oh, okay, so it's not 2% or 20%, it's like, you know, 60-40 or 50-50. I want you to be my technical co-founder. I've got a friend who actually has this sticker on his laptop. And I keep promising to make him a t-shirt with this on it because he gets so many requests from non-technical founders saying, I would really love for you to be my technical co-founder. So sometimes this works, but generally not. Okay, number 8, your product should be perfect before you launch. Again, this is one of these ones that I think when I talk to people, they generally go, oh yeah, I get it. I know I shouldn't launch, you know, something that I spent months and months on. I should just get it out there. But then their behavior doesn't match that. And I think there's some psychology behind it where, you know, people don't like to launch things that actually look bad and that people are going to be critical of. So there's a bit of psychology there. My favorite quote on this is from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, who famously said that if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched it too late. And if you look at LinkedIn in early, what was this, 2003, so about the time that it launched, it was pretty crappy. It was really crappy. There's lots of examples. I'll just show you one other. This is the Facebook before they could afford to get Facebook.com. So crappy is okay. So one way that I think about this for most startups is to say, who are your target customers and how many of them are there in the world? And most people will say, oh, well, you know, my target customer is, you know, this type of business or this type of consumer, and there are 100 million of them. And you go, great. Okay, so if you launch your product and it's really, really crappy, and the first 100 people that see it think it's really bad, does that really matter very much when, you know, there's still 100 million customers out there that haven't seen it? So it's actually generally okay for you to get something really crappy launched and get some feedback early on from your customers and iterate, even if they're not entirely happy with it, because that will give you the feedback you need to be able to move quickly. So related to that, the concept of an MVP or minimum viable product, I think this is really important just to spend a minute or two on. The definition that I like of an MVP is that it's the smallest feature set that delivers customer value and enables learning about customer needs. What a lot of people get wrong is they think an MVP is actually version 1 of their product.
Oh.
And I've met people who've spent upwards of $100,000 building what they describe as an MVP. MVPs for most products can actually be disposable. So I like to think of MVPs as something that you can create without ever intending that it will become part of your actual product. It can be a quick experiment. It can be a landing page with a sign-up form. So an MVP for most startups should actually be something that's super cheap and ends up being thrown in the bin once you've done the learning about what your customer needs. Okay, so we're progressing through the kind of life cycle of launching a startup here. The next thing you hear a lot of people say is that you need to have a mentor who's been a successful founder. And they all kind of look at, people they've seen on Shark Tank or read about, the Atlassian founders or the Canva team or whatever, and they go, that's who I want as my mentor. Again, I'm going to show you a tweet. This is from Bryce Roberts, an investor in the US, and he laments that when successful people give advice, what I hear is, here are the lottery numbers, they work for me. It's a little bit unfair because you should get advice from successful people. The problem, though, is that in Australia, very often people who have been successful in startups have had one success. We don't have very many people who've been through that loop 4 or 5 times. And so generally, I think the advice that's going to be more useful is from people who have the experience of working with groups of startups, either because they're an angel investor or they've run a VC fund or in some other way they've had that kind of breadth of experience across multiple companies, rather than someone who's done something once in one company. Okay, getting towards the end here. This is another one that I think trips a lot of people up. And this one actually sounds like it should be true, that you should get as many customers as possible. Like, customers are good, right? Especially if they're going to pay you money. Actually, for a lot of companies, getting a lot of customers early on is really unhelpful. So there's a way of thinking through this, which I think can help, which is to optimize for user happiness early on. This actually came out of Y Combinator. So YC looked at a lot of the companies that have been through over the last decade, and they said, you know what, the ones that have done really well have tended to optimize early on for a very small number of customers who have a very specific need, and they've delivered their product for those people. They've built a very limited set of features. The functionality has been so limited that it's really only useful to a very narrow group of customers. But because they love it so much, they will then evangelize your product. They will help you get other customers. Your cost of customer acquisition will be greatly reduced because of word of mouth. And your online reviews, and you'll get 5-star Google reviews and Facebook reviews. Whereas if you did the opposite, which is to just try and get it out to as many people as possible, you'll get lukewarm reception from a lot of those people because it's version 1 of your product. Your reviews will be mediocre, and in a lot of cases, your cost of customer acquisition will be really high, and so will your churn. So you'd be familiar with the concept of churn. The number of, or the proportion of your users who disappear every month. If you deliver something that's only somewhat useful to them, then you'll have high churn. That's a pretty tough point from which to go and raise money from investors. If they're looking at your company and saying, okay, so we did a bit of due diligence and we can see that you've got 2.8 stars and really high rate of attrition from your users. A quick example that I really like, this is Boosted Boards, which is an electric skateboard company in Silicon Valley. I had the pleasure of trying out one of their boards at their factory. These things are awesome. They go 40 kilometers an hour from a standing start. They accelerate like mad, little Bluetooth handheld controller. When Boosted launched their first electric skateboard, they only were willing to sell it to experienced skateboarders. They said, we are not going to try and sell it to anyone else, even though it could be used as a commuting kind of tool. They actually resisted selling their boards to anyone who couldn't demonstrate that they were a really proficient skateboarder. Because what they realized was that if they had good skateboarders using it early on, they would love it. They'd be able to use it really well straight away. The reviews would be good. They would have strong word of mouth referral. And that's exactly what happened. So they've expanded their product line since then, but this is a really sensible way to start off. Okay, so we talked about raising money a couple of times. Often a lot of founders are encouraged to raise money from friends or family before they approach kind of arm's length investors, whether that be angels or VC funds. Personally, I think if you want to raise money from friends and family, that's a personal decision. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but something to think about if you're looking at that as a possibility. A little rule of thumb that I've developed, which I think can be helpful, is that smart involved money is better than dumb passive money, which in turn is better than dumb involved money. And I'll explain what I mean by each of those. So smart involved money, that photo on the left is actually Alicia McDonald, who's a principal at Airtree Ventures. So they're one of Australia's most successful venture capital funds. Smart involved money means someone who has the experience of working with lots of startups and is smart in as much as they can add value by sharing their experience with you when they invest in your company. And involved means that they're willing to roll up their sleeves and actually help. So they're willing to actually be involved in your business. So that's the best sort of money. The next best is dumb passive money. So dumb, not being unkind about it, but dumb means from someone who doesn't understand startups and really can't add much value. And this could be a family member or a friend. And it's fine as long as they're passive. And also as long as you don't do it on some silly valuation that says your company's worth $20 million before you launch anything. The third category is the most dangerous sort, and this is dumb involved money. So dumb meaning the person doesn't have much experience or any ability to add value, but they want to run your company. And unfortunately, you do see some investors out there that still have this approach. You know, maybe they've made money in bricks and mortar retail, or they've been a property investor or something, and they want to have a little dabble in investing in startups. That's okay until the point where they say, yeah, but I'm older than the founder, or I've got some business experience, and I'm gonna meet with the founder every Monday morning at 9 a.m. and I want to be the chair of the board, and they're basically going to try and run the show. That's not helpful. So I think before you take money from anyone, you want to try and understand which of these categories they fit in. Okay, last one, BS statement number 12 is you can pay someone to fundraise for your startup. This one's a little bit controversial because, you know, in theory, you can actually hire a third party to help you to raise money for your startup and maybe give you a bit of advice. But most investors like nothing less than to have some person approach them and say, "Hey, I'm here to talk to you on behalf of company A. You know, I'm here as a fundraising agent." The best bit of advice that I've seen is actually from Steve Baxter, and there's a good article here with a link in the bottom there, where he talks about the fact that a lot of these advisors will bleed your company dry or make it so your startup is fundamentally uninvestable at a later stage. And so I think it's generally not helpful at all to try and engage people to help you. So we, in our founders course, we did an interview with Alicia McDonald at Airtree. And she said, look, her advice for founders is that if you're the CEO, you need to expect that you will commit 3 to 6 months of your time to the process of raising a funding round. By all means, get people to help you on the periphery, but you, the founder, need to lead that. And from an investor perspective, they only want to meet with the founders. They're not interested in talking to anyone else. So you need to be thinking of it in those terms, in terms of the amount of time commitment you're going to make. Okay, a bonus one, and then we might stop, and if we've got some time, we'll do some Q&A. Is that you have to be born an entrepreneur. I see a lot of people that say, "Oh, I've never started a company. I've always been an employee. I don't even know if I could do this." So I just wanted to share something really quickly, which is, if anyone would like to take a guess at which entrepreneur this is. I think the glasses maybe give it away a little bit. It's this guy, Jeff Bezos. So this is Jeff before he became an entrepreneur, and this is him today. Lots of people looked at this kind of nerdy Jeff Bezos guy who'd never been in business before and said, "You know what, Jeff, this probably isn't for you. No, don't do this." So my take on this is that anyone can be an entrepreneur. Not everyone is cut out to being an entrepreneur, but you can absolutely learn to be successful replicating the behaviors of other successful entrepreneurs. And don't be put off by people that say you don't look or smell like an entrepreneur. Okay, I better wrap it up there. So Atula, how did we go? Have we got some time for discussion?
Yes, we extended the time of this session to 1.5 hours. So we have half an hour. So there are some questions. Let me go through the chat first of all. I'll go from bottom. Yeah, you can ask Sebastian.
Colin, as I understand, you mentioned that Zapier is the tool of your choice. Is that correct?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
You mentioned earlier on that Zapier is the tool of the choice. Is that correct?
Yeah, one of many, but I do like it.
Yeah. Would you just spend a bit of time commenting on the strengths and the weaknesses of that tool?
Yeah, look, different people will use it differently. I use it to move things around. So I use Zapier. We have MailChimp as our kind of primary EDM tool. We use tools like Opt-in Monster on our website, and so I find Zapier is really helpful for taking any customer information or anything else that comes in via a website or a web form or a type form or Google form, and moving it around. So it's really think of it as a pipe, if you will, that it allows you to move information from one place to another and create rules and triggers.
Yeah, a lot of thank you things coming in the chat. Can you stop sharing the screen, Colin? That way people can ask questions.
That's better.
Anyone else with a question?
Just follow up, Atula or Colin. You mentioned just one strength of the product. Can you talk about its weaknesses? Sorry,
weaknesses of Zapier?
Yeah.
I'm probably not the right person, to be honest. Zapier is a tool that I'm a user. I'm certainly not a power user or a Zapier expert. There will be others better qualified than me. It won't allow you to build a tech company from scratch, right? So Zapier is not a panacea.
No.
There are plenty of other tools that you'll need, but as a user of it, I find it helpful.
Right. So the main thing I heard you said that is describe it as a pipe that allows you to move things from one spot to another easily. What might be another strength of it?
So what I'd suggest is if you go to Zapier.com, I know when I started using it, there were some really good explainer videos on the website, and I'm going to suggest that that's actually the best way to get something as a good starting point. I found them really helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. There was a question about the pictures, about the Getty pitch, and that's really good. I have been telling people to look at Getty pitch before coming to our pitch night, but I don't think people took it seriously. I've actually put a link to actually ask people to search for Getty pitch on Google and YouTube and learn that and come to our pitch night. Yeah, could you give an example of why that is so good, Colin? Let's unpack that.
Yeah, looks for me the key is in the first statement in the Getty pitch, which is the one that starts off with "you know how," and the reason it matters is that most founders have been so close to their idea for so long that they find it really difficult to get into the head of somebody who has no knowledge of their business, hasn't been involved, doesn't understand the problem, and you often see this when you see people trying to pitch pitch their idea to somebody who's never heard of it before, you're not familiar with it, and they just go, I have no idea what that is. So the you know how actually forces you to explain the context and the problem, and you can do it in a kind of an interactive way. When you're in a conversation with someone, and if they're nodding and going, yep, I get it, then that means that you can continue. If they're looking blankly, then you need to spend more time, right? So you need to say, right, let me unpack that a bit more. You can say to them, does that make sense? And if they say, no, I don't understand it, then don't go to the solution until you've explained the problem some more.
Okay.
Thanks for that. I'll put the link to our pitch night, which is Thursday night. If you're on Meetup, you'll see the Thursday night event on the Meetup. If you're on Eventbrite, I'll put the Eventbrite link in chat. There's a question from Brendan. You mentioned networking to find advisors. Do you have any advice on how to find customers? It's a good question.
Customers, yeah. Customers are more important than advisors. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on what sort of business you're building. If you're solving a problem that you actually have some deep understanding of, then you probably know some customers. In fact, I'd turn it around the other way and say, if you're starting a startup to solve a problem for customers that you've not ever met and you don't have any direct connections to any of them, that's a massive question mark for me. So I suspect at a really simplistic level, you probably already know some customers personally. So I'd go and talk to those people that you already know in your network. I would then, depending on whether it's a B2B or B2C, I would start to create a list of early adopters. So, you know, we talked earlier about the optimizing for user happiness and the fact that you should find, you know, those early users who your product really solves a problem very well for them. I would start with them and create a list. And it could be, you know, getting on LinkedIn and finding people that have a certain job title. Or one thing that actually I find a lot of people find helpful is interview some of those early potential customers. And at the end of the interview say, okay, do you know 2 or 3 other people that are similar to you that you could introduce me to? I got a friend who's in the medtech space, and his target customer was nurses in hospitals, and he did interviews with nurses, 15 minutes back to back, and he did a couple of hundred of them because nurses just love talking about the problems that they have in managing their workflow. And at the end of every interview, he said, "Do you know 2 other nurses that would like to speak to me about this same problem?" And invariably, they said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the names. I'll introduce you."
Thanks, Colin. I have another question from John. The question is not very clear, John. If you can unmute and ask the questions. It says, found that founders are not always the ambassadors for raising dollars in the past. Suggested bringing on C-level. Your thoughts, John? If you can elaborate on that. Are you there, John?
John Perry, you're talking.
Ah, yes, John Perry. Yes.
Is that who you're asking?
I don't know.
Was it your question?
No, it wasn't me.
No, it wasn't me. It's another John.
Okay, yes, and it wasn't me asking.
Anyway, it's a question about whether you should
There's
bring
another
in...
John Atula.
Okay, the other John, can you unmute yourself and ask the question, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Atila. Now, the question I had was going back in time when we had net worth individuals investing in startup businesses. And we found that the companies that were trying to raise money, foremost technical kind of applications, and people that had designed them were the founders, and they were very technically minded. What we found more than once is when they presented to net worth individuals, that within a very short time frame, the net worth individuals just walked away from the table for reasons that the pitch was so technically and so functionally orientated that they just left. And I understand, as you said in one of your I think points where you said people won't get triggered by the hockey stick effect, right? Well, giving kind of revenues over time that go sky high. But it's, of course, easy. When you go from 0 to 1, that is not even 100%. When you go from 1 to 2, it goes to 100%. So you do need to present your projections going forward. You won't get away with net worth individuals just talking about functionality. It just doesn't fly. You'll have to give them projection over time, and we'll have to look at cash flow, not over 5 years, as you mentioned, which is, of course, quite interesting if you can do that. I'd love to do that, by the way, but that's what I find. I don't know what your thoughts are, Colin. There, it's not a critical note. It's just that I've seen that the people, the founders, it's so technically orientated that they're not able to pitch it in such a manner that you get net worth individuals putting money into your business.
No, it's a good question, John. So I ran an early stage fund that invested in about 10 companies over a couple of year period. And we were mostly looking at companies that were pre-revenue or had just a little bit of early revenue. And we absolutely found exactly what you said, which is that if they just come along and show us their product and it's a highly technical pitch that's all about product functionality or the technology, that's not going to get anyone over the line.
No.
So we did want to see the business opportunity. But I guess the point that I think a lot of people miss is that in the very early days, like when you're raising genuine seed funding from whether it's high net worth individuals or angel groups or early stage funds, they generally recognize that everyone is putting their time and their money into the business in order to see whether you can create a successful business. They're not investing on the back of some 5-year or any other year's projections of kind of future revenues. They're saying how big is the opportunity, right? So they're saying, well, even if what you think you're going to build today turns out to be wrong, which often is the opportunity big enough that we can see a path to making a successful company, even if we have to pivot multiple times and change our product or change our customer focus or some other way?
Yeah, it's a very delicate conversation when you have that with a kind of a founder, to tell him that he is not going to be the guy that's going to be the ambassador of the company. And I think you need to be very authentic and very upfront about that, because in the end, what does he want? Does he want the company to be successful, or has he got a big ego where he believes that he's the only one that can explain what he's been doing, right? And I think I've noticed, because in the past, I was part of a kind of a net worth individual group. We invested in biotechs and telecom and video conferencing when it wasn't even known yet. And we were very blunt, and we said, man, you're not going to be the guy that's going to pull this across. You're absolutely brilliant in what you do, but stick to your knitting, right? And don't try to be someone you're not, because it's not what we're looking for.
Sure. Let me just make one quick point, and then we might.
Yeah, sure, man.
But a quick point on that. Most investors will only invest in 1 or 2% of all of the opportunities that they see, and it doesn't mean that the ones that they don't invest in are not good companies. So my favorite example of that is a fund in the US called Bessemer Venture Partners. And if you go to their website, even to this day, you'll see their anti-portfolio listed on their website, and it's all the companies that they said no to. And it's got companies like Intel and Google and Tesla. So even smart investors can get it totally wrong.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.
A couple of questions that came in about the Startup Onramp course. There are a couple of people from overseas here on the call, one from Indonesia, another one from Malaysia. So that's great. We didn't actually put it on those, we didn't put on the Jakarta Silicon Beach, but people have found us through Eventbrite. And the question is, would the course suit anyone who is overseas?
Yeah, definitely. We've deliberately created the course to be geography agnostic. A lot of the people that we interview, there are 20 founders, investors, and other experts that we interview as part of the course. They're from Australia, so it has an Australian flavor to it. But the content very deliberately is created so that it's relevant to people anywhere in the world.
Yeah, that's great, because I know when I was looking for courses back in 2012, there was nothing Australian. I did Steve Blank's Lean Startup course. That was like that. And then there was the Y Combinator, which both are US based. So this is great. So would you suggest that people use those as well as this to give some sort of Australian flavor?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the Steve Blank course is awesome. It's very focused on customer development, which is one of the things that we cover in our course. So certainly that is a really useful one. The Y Combinator Startup School is really good. My reservation about that is that it's very Silicon Valley centric. So while it's pretty valuable, it seems to be particularly good if you're in Silicon Valley and you're surrounded by a bunch of Stanford grads. I find that a lot of the advice in that doesn't translate very accurately to most other contexts.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. Another one that came up is there a team price if there are 2 or 3 people in a startup?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so if you click through the link that Atula has circulated on the website, you'll see there's a team price. So the full price of the course is $999. We have a launch price of $497. Which we actually intended to keep that for a fairly short period of time, but given everyone's in lockdown, now's not the time to hike prices, so we're keeping that low. And then the team price is $300 per team member.
Yeah, that's great. So don't forget to click on that affiliate link, guys. And Colin, you have given is there a payment plan, installment thing as
Yeah, there
well?
is. Yeah, people can pay all up front or split it across 3 payments.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, let's go on to, there are a lot of questions. I don't think we'll have time to get to all those questions. You have Colin's details, so you can ask him privately, and I'm sure will you be happy to give some people, say, a 15 or 20-minute consultation or something like that?
Yeah, definitely. If anyone's got anything specific that they want to ping me, feel free. Twitter, email, LinkedIn, whatever works. Yeah, because we can put that slide back again before we finish. What I'll do at this point is I'll stop the recording. So thanks to everyone who has been watching the recording so far. Who knows, we might get some controversial questions when it is off the record. So this recording will be on the event page, as I said, on Meetup, and we'll send it to all of the Silicon Beach mailing list as well. Those who connected on Eventbrite, please check your emails. You'll get a message with the link. So thanks, everyone. The others stay on the call. I'm now going to stop the recording. Thanks, Colin. There are a lot of thank you messages coming in chat. It was very useful. Well, thanks, Tula. It's been fun.